Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I think as we're all critically aware, and as has been reinforced through the conversation this morning, Africa faces this dual challenge of an urgent need to power its growing economies and populations, but at the same time building a sustainable and climate resilient future. At Standard Bank, we are deeply committed to driving Africa's growth by financing and investing in infrastructure and energy in a way that supports access and security, but also in a way that balances the need to mitigate the impact of climate change. So in this regard, as Sim alluded to earlier, in 2022 we launched our climate policy, which commits us to a net zero pathway by 2050, but also sets some fairly ambitious targets at 450 billion by 2028 in terms of sustainable financing across green, social, and transition-eligible activities. And on the second panel today, I'm delighted to be joined by experts in the field to unpack this theme of energy security, but also the well-publicized infrastructure gap that exists on the continent. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists to please briefly introduce themselves and the organizations that they represent, and then we will get into the conversation. Anna, could I start with you, on my left?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So my name is Anna. I'm the Group CEO of Africa GreenCo. Africa GreenCo is the first independent power trader and renewable energy buyer in the SADC region and member of the Southern African Power Pool with unanimous consent of all state utilities of the SADC region. We operate in Zambia, where our headquarters are, and also operate in South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and have recently applied for our licenses in the DRC. Thank you so much.
My name is Christopher Clarke. Good afternoon, and I am the co-founder and managing partner of Inspired Evolution. We're a specialized climate finance private equity firm with 5 offices, head office in Cape Town, the international office out of London, and we manage around $850 million of equity capital for investments into climate in Africa.
Sandile?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandile Peta. I'm the sector lead for energy and infrastructure South Africa. There I oversee the portfolio of strategic integrated energy programs for South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Rudi Dix. I'm the head of the project management office in the presidency. We do a few things. Of course, the Operation Vulindlela is the core work that we do, and some of the work related to the energy crisis and energy security. I also run the sort of combination of that with the Just Energy Transition implementation plan, and we oversee the coordination and supporting the implementation of that plan that has been adopted by Cabinet a few years ago.
I can assure you Rudi is an incredibly busy man, as I found out in trying to track him down for the prep for this panel. But as is everybody on the panel, so thank you for those introductions, everybody. Anna, you gave me a really great segue into the first question that I wanted to ask in the question that you posed earlier. Your work with GreenCo takes you into some very challenging sub-Saharan African markets. And given your personal experience, and I could see your passion coming through in the question that you asked earlier, and we touched on this a little bit in some of the prior panels, but I'd really like to get your sense of the climate change impacts that you're experiencing on the ground in some of these markets like Zambia, which are exacerbated by the droughts and the climate change that we're seeing.
No, absolutely. So I've been living personally in Zambia for almost a decade now, and our headquarters are in Zambia. So last year, and already 2019, we suffered the first drought. Then immediately last year, there was a very significant drought, which effectively left the power system extremely unstable, so much so that not only was there load shedding, which is just as business as usual during drought, but we actually were almost witnessing the entire system collapse. So with significant the only way to overcome that was through energy imports and through cross-border integrated market that exists, which is the Southern African Power Pool. So what we packaged together with Standard Bank, and it was, as Helen said, a very innovative project, and really credit goes to the bank for following suit and for looking at trading models in that level of detail. But what we managed to put together in collaboration with ZESCO towards the end of last year is to ensure that we bring in 10% of total energy capacity of Zambia for the next 5 months. And that not only left the grid stable, but also facilitated the ability for some of the increased mining output and agricultural output to continue, them being the key ingredients for GDP overall growth of the country. So notwithstanding IMF's significant projection on decrease of GDP growth in Zambia in June 2024, last year from 5.8% to 2.4%, actually the GDP growth reached 5.9%, almost 6% this year. Why? Because we managed to stabilize the grid, which managed to facilitate not only through cross-border imports, but renewable energy projects that we help deliver on the ground, additional capacity to make sure that those two key industries are kept whole. Because otherwise the overall economic would be not only climate catastrophe, but economic catastrophe as a whole. So that's what we see as a daily reality. And what we have always been promoting as Greenco is that regional lens. Yep. We need to have the cross-border view that when we have deficit in one country, we can optimize other countries and make sure that the power system, which is an integrated whole, works. And that is something that we are bringing to the lens of South Africa, which of course under the G20 has a very regional objective as well. And if you look at South Africa, the size of the forthcoming day-ahead market in South Africa compared to the Southern African Power Pool currently, it will trump it. Yep. But it's very important that the two speak to each other, because South African integrated transmission plan, which is going to attract significant private sector funding to it, 14,000 kilometers of new transmission line investments, if that investment is not linked to new interconnectors to the region, we fear that the national treasury impact on the balance sheet will be significant, and also will result in a significant increase for consumers in South Africa of what is a transmission input cost. Right. So all in a kind of convoluted way, what I'm trying to say is integrated lens, power pools are integrated, and that is a must, as has been evidenced by the transaction last year, imports from South Africa and Mozambique that saved the Zambian power system. That remains to be the case no matter which lens we take, i.e. South African lens, Zimbabwean lens, Mozambican lens, etc.
Thank you. Speaking of South Africa, Rudi, if I may turn to you, just from a South African government perspective, how do you see the current energy dilemma, balancing the climate challenge with the need for reliable supply and the imperative of ensuring that we have a just energy transition?
Thanks, Steve. I mean, absolutely. It's not a dichotomy. It's not either or. I think the one thing that we've been successfully doing is to see energy security, energy efficiency, cost competitiveness, and the ability for us to see a significant shift in the way that we produce energy through a just mechanism as an integrated approach. And I think through the work that we've done, we've been able to do that, and may just by use of examples. I mean, when we sort of did the changes to the Electricity Regulatory Act and the Schedule 2 that allowed for registration of utility scale generation projects, and of course embedded that now into the subsequent era that came into effect in 1st of January 2025. The more important part was that you were not only producing for own use, you were producing for multiple off-takers that was not Eskom. And I think that was fairly significant. When we track the projects that are there, in actual fact, businesses take decisions on what would be the lowest sort of cost of what generation outbuild. So there's choices. The law doesn't say you've got to build this or that. You make choices around the generation capacity. And we track the 22.5 gigawatts of electricity generation. 95% of that is renewable energy. So businesses consciously decide to invest in those decisions because of sustainability reasons, because of cost competitiveness, because of efficiency, and because they see themselves in the future growing and having to get export markets, and these are important decisions that they do take. So the choice is not just, it's energy security versus that. I think that what we have seen is integration of that. And so, of course, there are trade-offs in this conversation, so I put it in a nice way, but in actual fact, there are always the sort of trade-offs that are there. But the point of the matter is that we can present any form, and I missed sort of Bjorn's conversation early on presentation, but I got the back end of the debate with Deepak. I mean, we can present any form of data. The fact is that we are, per capita, one of the highest carbon emitters. And therefore, we can make choices around how we produce energy very differently. Of course, the choices that we make has consequences, and so therefore, the element of a just energy transition is quite pertinent and critical, because we are reliant on coal production for our energy production, and therefore it's going to be critical for us to make those choices, because it impacts on miners, it impacts on communities, it impacts on the gogo that sells products next to a mine or by a coal power station, it impacts on young people, it impacts on the skill system on what we need to churn. And therefore you've got to have this sort of forward-looking, and that's going to be quite critical. For me, I think that's part of what we've got to do, and I think that we sort of as a policy, from a policy point of view, I think we do pretty well in trying not to decarbonize, and be careful. I'm being careful here, right? We're decarbonizing at a rate that I think is pragmatic and that takes into account our own circumstances, and I think that's an important part, right? So we've got to make decisions around closures of some of the power stations, but we've also got to make a decision for long-term investments and how we see technology evolve for hard-to-abate sectors. And I think this is quite an important part of the overall conversation. So it's not a dichotomy. It's a part of an integrated policy response that we've got to see in the long run where we're going towards.
Okay. Thank you. And Christopher, just building on Rudi's point around substantial investment in renewable energy, as a long-term investor, I suppose, in sustainable energy, where are you seeing the primary opportunities and risks in the context of the energy dilemma at the moment? And how do financial institutions, I suppose, like Standard Bank, and our sustainability approach either help or dissuade you from your investment thesis?
Thanks. So I think let's start off with understanding what we mean by the energy trilemma. So it's really the challenge of simultaneously achieving three critical but often competing goals, which is energy security, it's energy equity and inclusion and affordability, and then it's environmental sustainability. And that's a difficult choice, right? We have the choice as a country. Every country in the continent makes different choices. They have different resource bases and different contexts in which they make those decisions. But I think for us, living in the trenches for doing this for the last 20 years, we're actually seeing a shape shift away from that trilemma, actually to more of what I'd like to say, a reinforcing convergence of those factors. And that's driven largely by the new technologies and business models that we see, as part of the sort of green climate revolution. And it really is a revolution. I'll get onto the revolution in a second, especially from a solar point of view. So today, unlike some of the facts that you might have heard earlier, my facts are different. And my facts are today, solar and wind is undoubtedly the most affordable form of energy that is deployed globally and on the continent. The intermittency issues are rapidly being solved with new technologies for battery energy storage systems. And those price points now you'll see from dispatchable power that's gone out in South Africa being least cost that outcompetes equivalent spinning reserve fossil fuels, etc. So we are seeing that every day, and we're seeing it actually increasing. The prices are getting lower, and so increasing in momentum. So we see that the sort of other part to that is that we are terrible at transitioning. We've got a bad transition track record for all the reasons. Human behavior, we resist change, sunk capital, the strategic interest driven by profit. And as Mark Twain said, denial ain't just the biggest river in Egypt. So we really are still stuck with sometimes medieval institutions, but with godlike technology. And we really have the opportunity to overcome any of those risks. I'll get into the risks in a second. But I just want to talk about China very briefly. There is no two ways about it that China has made those strategic decisions to embrace the green economy and to lead this revolution because they see it as a strategic advantage. They've done their numbers, they've done their sums. This is not misinformation or misguided decision. They developed about 300 gigawatts last year, an unprecedented year of the total global 600 odd gigawatts. And yes, they still are developing coal, but according to multiple sources, I think China is getting increasingly close to peak emissions, where I believe the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world will follow. So I just wanted to set that straight. And Africa, we're seeing in Africa adopting, whether you want to call it leapfrogging or not, it's happening, and it's not just the telecom sector and mobile. We see that in particularly distributed renewable energy, where the risk of energy poverty, which is real and really sets us back as a continent, can be solved through sort of cross-sector technologies. So you're using mobile, pay-as-you-go, and peer-to-peer banking systems in order to roll out solar home systems and product and batteries. And it's a form of microfinance, but with a very deliberate intention. And I think those are the main points. In terms of the opportunity side, I mean, we love risk at Inspired Evolution because the longer we stay in the trenches, the more we learn to manage it. And if you really embrace it and understand it, obviously there's a lot of unknowns. There is a remarkable opportunity set in Africa, and we see that with about $130 to $200 billion of infrastructure funding deficit at the moment per year.
Thanks, Christopher. Couldn't agree with you more. The opportunity set is enormous. And so, Sandile, as we kind of collectively look to tackle this mammoth task of addressing access, security, and sustainability around energy supply, can you please share some of your thoughts on the importance of early stage planning and project preparation in ensuring that we can actually get these projects to a point of bankability? I mean, as we consider the just transition in the context of this country, South Africa, also be interested in your views on how planning extends beyond just the project, and thinking a little bit about what impact it may have on the broader economy.
Sure, thanks, Steve. So I'd also like to start with some facts. These are not my facts, they are from the IEA. The IEA is telling us that in 2024, global spending on energy or investments hit $2 trillion. But what they also tell us is that only 3% of this $2 trillion came to Africa, which is quite astonishing. And I'm sure you would have heard earlier, we only get 3% of this 2 trillion, but we know that 1 in 2 people do not have access to electricity. We also know that more than 500,000 women and children died prematurely on the continent due to lack of access to clean cooking. So, I mean, this is the situation. We're sitting with $85 billion investment gap on the continent. And infrastructure South Africa, within South Africa, obviously, is seeking to close this infrastructure investment gap. And if I can just summate in a nutshell, this is being achieved really through 3 mechanisms. One is providing limited fiscal project preparation funding to infrastructure projects. The second, given that we are providing limited fiscal funding, is to then attract non-fiscal funding from other actors to the infrastructure projects. And then the third really is expediting permitting and licensing of projects. So making sure that once the project is there, it's getting to a financial close and getting to commercial operation. So just to touch briefly in terms of the project preparation methodology which we utilize. So we have adopted and locally adapted the 5-case model from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority in the UK. And really this is how you get a project from the planning phases up through to bankability. And essentially this 5-case model has got 5 key components. One is the strategic case. So it's really the case for change or the rationale. Why should this project exist? It's the economic case. It's the commercial case, which is really speaking to, can you strike a credible commercial deal? Can you put the contracts in place to make this project to happen? It is the financial case, as well as the management case, which is really speaking to, do you have the requisite institutional capacity and capability to be able to deliver the project? So in terms of, obviously we've started at the beginning by mentioning the lack of investment which is coming to Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And then the question is, how do we get it to come here? And what this 5-case model is helping us to do is to answer some of the bankability questions which investors are going to be looking for answers for to be able to put their money here. So questions of costs and benefits. I've already spoken about institutional capacity, market risks, of course. That is always the first thing that the investors will talk about. And I think I was watching a YouTube the other day, and it was also talk about actual risk versus perceived risks that investors look at. And of course, regulatory constraints and infrastructure bottlenecks. So this framework for business case development is helping us to answer some of these questions. And so just to close there, Steve, I think some of the questions we need to ask ourselves is also, how can we build on this framework and other frameworks to really attract this investment, and beyond just emissions, electrons and molecules, how can we make sure that this investment actually translates to economic growth through greater participation in domestic and export-oriented industries? And also, how does it provide social security? How do we create decent jobs and promote regional development? Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. I know, Anna, you look like you wanted to make a point there on the back of Sandile's
I just wanted to go back to your question on, and maybe spice it up a little bit. Yeah. What are banks doing right and what are banks doing wrong? Because in our view, it's not even about how much you attract in terms of funding, it's how it's disbursed. So and it's beautiful to see that Standard Bank and your team are becoming energy sector professionals, because you have to become. Yeah. What happened before is the REAP, lauded as the most successful renewable energy program out there. Yes, it was successful. Yes, it added a lot. But we are talking about also adding more than $15 billion to the national treasury of South Africa for guaranteeing Eskom's power purchase obligations. I mean, that is not smart disbursement of funding. That was lazy. That was round 1, great. Round 2, great, maybe. Round 3, change it. No more national treasury support. But no, it went round 3, round 4, round 5, etc. That's lazy lending. And then, of course, from your perspective, you see your Basel III requirements, etc., and how you need to. But the entire industry was lazy. That made Eskom and the utilities angry at the private sector. That made renewable energy developers lazy at just leaving the connection at the grid, not thinking integratedly about distribution, ancillary services, transmission requirements, etc. So I would say we slept for the past 10 years in an industry whilst tapping ourselves on the back, aren't we great, we did the REAP. Yeah. So that's the problem. Now the ITP, if it replicates the same in transmission, we're talking about $23 billion, which, if it is accounted on National Treasury's balance sheet, which I understand the credit guarantee facility is trying not to make happen, but then the biggest elephant in the room is the IMF. Well, they say it's truly not national treasury impact. If that then happens, then the problem is not the fact that we are not leveraging funding. The problem is we are not leveraging funding in a smart way that then gives you the ability to do just transition by utilizing the fiscus for true social needs. Health, water might even need a bit of support, etc. So I just wanted to add that because it's all integrated: finance, energy, treasury, IMF, region. It's a whole big puzzle. And so far we've looked at our isolated pieces of, components.
I agree with you. And you make a whole lot of fundamental and fantastic points in what you're saying there. What has been fascinating to watch is how financing and banking has evolved significantly over the last couple of years, in particular, as the market has moved to a trading and aggregation type model. And without that, it'd be very difficult to see the growth that we're experiencing in that space at the moment. So I think there is some positive to take out of it, but there's lots of work still to be done. Sandile, I want to bring you in here again, please, if you don't mind, because Anna raised this point around the ITP, and it's one thing building energy supply. There's another thing being able to transmit the electrons across a grid and distribute them to the end users. Can you give us a sense of where we are from a South African perspective in terms of the energy transmission infrastructure, please?
Sure, thanks, Steve. So the draft integrated resource plan for 2023 tells us that we need 30 gigawatts of generation by 2030. It further goes on to say that through the decade to 2034, we need growth up to 54 gigawatts of generation capacity. Now the question is, of course, how are you going to enable this generation capacity? And the Transmission Development Plan, which is the country's plan for transmission, and you would have heard for sure on this number, it tells us that we need to build 14,500 kilometers of new transmission lines, including 210 transformers. And it also tells us that this is going to cost 440 billion rand through the decade. And the transmission build rates, which will be required, if you just average it over the period, it means we'll need to build at a rate of 1,450 kilometers per annum. Now, we know that today, we are currently building at a rate over the past decade or so of about 300 kilometers per annum. So you can imagine that this is a massive challenge. So to solve the problem of the technical constraints in terms of the magnitude and pace at which we're able to roll out this transmission infrastructure, which is required to be able to unlock the generation, an independent transmission procurement program has been established. And this independent transmission program has selected certain corridors within the country, and it's intended to, in the first phase, to procure 1,164 kilometers of transmission lines, and this will unlock 3,222 megawatts of generation capacity. And then in terms of progress on this program, so towards the end of last year, a market sounding exercise was started, and by February of this year it was concluded. There were more than 130 respondents to that market sounding exercise. And in March of this year, a ministerial determination was issued for the independent transmission procurement. So basically saying this much here, etc., so the market knows what is happening. And then in April, the draft independent transmission procurement regulations were also issued for public comments. And then just recently now in July, the request for qualification to qualify bidders to this program was issued. And this is expected to close by about September of this year. And then the actual request for proposals is expected to be issued before the end of this year. And so we've talking about the technical constraints. We've spoken about what program has been put in place to solve the rate of build requirements. Then there's the question about the 440 billion. How are you going to get these funds? So, I mean, I think it was touched on a bit. We know in the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program that the offtake, because of the balance sheet of Eskom and their credit worthiness, was guaranteed by the sovereign, which means that there's a huge amount of contingent liabilities which is now sitting on the sovereign due to the REAP program. And therefore, in this program, basically National Treasury is saying, guys, sorry, we cannot take on so much more contingent liability. It's going to be quite difficult. So to sort of get around this, what has been proposed is a credit guarantee vehicle, which we've already heard about. And this is really to solve two things. One, to reduce the contingent liability on the sovereign balance sheet, and as well to limit investor risk as well, of course, because the investors want to know that somehow there's an insurance plan for them if there's offtake issues. So to conclude, clearly the large-scale integration of renewable energy at the scale and pace that we need to do it at needs this significant and accelerated expansion of grid capacity. And the current approach being followed is a dual approach. One, you've got the National Transmission Company of South Africa, which will continue to build transmission capacity according to the Transmission Development Plan. But this is further augmented in parallel by this independent transmission procurement program to help to accelerate the process. In following this approach, hopefully, we can be able to meet the country's economic needs, as well as spreading the risk, not putting all our eggs in one basket, as well as limiting fiscal exposure.
Thanks, Sandile. Yeah, these numbers are staggering. And so, Christopher, probably a good segue into a question for you. From an investor's perspective, what are your key requirements for public-private partnerships to enable some of the private capital that we need so desperately to flow into critical energy projects? And I suppose beyond blended finance, how should government be partnering with other stakeholders in terms of providing the appropriate insurance, credit insurance, as was referenced earlier, to crowd more private sector capital in?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fundamental issues. Certainly for us, if we look over the last 20 years, what's really driven success, and it's partnerships. Not just public-private partnerships, but partnerships in general. SDG 17 is undoubtedly a sort of cross-cutting goal because you can't deliver on any of the others without those partnerships. And I would argue that there's also community private-public partnerships is what this topic should be about, because many of these projects and infrastructure rollouts are in deep rural areas where community, not just social license to operate, but community equity is so fundamental. The biggest tangible benefits we've ever seen in our projects are where community equity is actually structured into projects and long-term tangible cash flows actually move to communities over 20 to 25 years as opposed to just business to business or a few jobs here and there. So the main attributes we look for, there's certain generic ones, and then we sort of specialized in looking at different attributes depending on whether it's utility scale all the way down to distributed renewable energy at the sort of last mile. The main generic ones, the most important for us is stated intention. I heard it earlier from someone. Intention is such an important thing. You need to find the partner that's like-minded. We have lots of private-to-private partnerships. We have a great partnership with Standard Bank. And we intentionally seek out Standard Bank, and we hope it's reciprocal because you guys have this amazing sustainability policy and you share similar values to us. So you've got to find that alignment in your partner because that's generally what is required for a long-term partnership. You don't want a partnership that's there and within a year or two, you have all sorts of problems because you find that there's misalignment. I would say the next is definitely, obviously, political cohesion to make sure that public sector's commitments are real. It's been backed at the highest levels with its commitments to low carbon trajectories, whatever it might be in your infrastructure rollout. And agility. You need agility, especially in this modern day and age when things are shifting rapidly. There are a lot of known unknowns, all the things I learned from Rumsfeld back when I was a teenager. I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I think he's actually talking about a lot of things that make a lot more sense to me these days. But those are the things that agility is so important, because you need to flex your business models when you hit headwinds. And we've survived many of those headwinds, and at a portfolio level, even as a business, by being able to shape-shift rapidly. So public sector mustn't over-prescribe what they want in that partnership. Yes, it's important to make sure that projects don't fail, and I think the IPP rollout of initial rounds and REAP was great, that they brought in so many international consultants and really thought through that, because you didn't want to be left with a whole bunch of white elephant projects, by people just putting in a low bid. But at the same time, you really need that agility. Capacity, we really struggle with capacity in a lot of our frontier countries. We're providing strategic energy in Burundi, like 20% of its national energy. We have to sort of drive the guy from Rejadiso, from his office, 5 hours to our site to measure his own electricity meter, to come back to invoice so that we can take the invoice. These are real challenges on the ground in many of the countries. We don't have that. The other thing is balanced approaches to risk-reward apportionment is very, very important for us commercially. Because at the end of the day, the new models that are emerging, which I think are really important, the blended finance is really making, we are involved with a lot of the Mission 300 World Bank Zafiri initiative now to try and bring energy to their very ambitious target of 300 million rural new connections by 2030. I think it's going to be more like 2035, but that's half of the 600 million energy deficit that we've got. Those can only be done through very carefully crafted de-risk blended finance models. In addition to that, you need a longer-term patient capital, so more permanent capital structures are what that particular initiative is, and I think we need to see more of that. There's too much of an artificial timeline in shorter term, certainly private equity, and we've lived that. The other problem is that there's still this crazy high preferred return hurdle from international money. Even when that money comes from concessionary, European Union, and other deliberately climate finance sort of backed money, you'll find that those DFIs, which still make the predominant part of our investors, are hell for leather negotiating the 8% compounding hurdle rate, right, which is just crazy. Yeah. So those are some of the main attributes I think are really important.
Thank you, Christopher. Rudi, it's probably a reasonably selfish question from my perspective as head of the SA business, but I'd be very keen to get an update on your work with Operation Vulindlela. Obviously set to prioritize the end of load shedding, focus on energy security. I believe your current streak is about 112 days, if I'm not mistaken, of uninterrupted supply, and that was obviously through the winter months. Can you give us a quick update there? And then maybe just a quick synopsis on how the project management office is looking to fast track some of these energy projects and any of the key blockages that you're tackling at the moment.
Thanks, Steve, but let me come back to Anna, because I wanted to agree with her. That's the one thing, right, Anna, I agree with you, that I thought the financial sector got money for mahala through the REAP program, right? Because where in the world you get a 20-year PPA, and you can sign off and then says, don't worry, you'll get this guarantee for 20-year PPA. You get an offtake guaranteed for 20 years. And it's quite interesting, because as soon as we changed that model, right? As soon as we introduced, I'm teasing you, Sam, right? I'm teasing you. Don't worry. I mean, there's lots of risk to these things, but I think the financial sector came on board. But what's interesting from Anna saying that financial sector is lazy was the ability for our financial sector to innovate and adapt. It was very, when Minister Mantashe signed the last thing around taking away the threshold in December 2022, right? We then went about setting up this energy one-stop shop through NECOM, directly to your question. And we sort of mapped out what does it, because we didn't quite know, right? We didn't quite know, where do you start when you decide as an investor, as your board says, I'm going to invest in a 200 megawatt plant, PV, right? And where do you start? Do I get a water use license first? Do I get this approval or that approval? Do others run concurrent? When do I achieve financial close? Must I register first before I get, a budget quote or grid access? These are all sort of vexed questions that some of us didn't quite know about it. But eventually we managed to find that out. And by the way, for a registration project in 2022, the last one that did it in the old system was a good friend who is now retired from Sibanya Gold, right? The Sibanya Gold project of 65 megawatts took 4 years. 4 years, right? We then worked on an average of 1,000 days for registered projects to be able to do that. We cut that down to under a year. And some of the projects got on within 6 months. Our friends at African Rainbow Minerals, through solar, were able to get their projects within 6 months. I think you funded them. But the fact of the matter was that when they went to the banks and said, look, we're looking to build a 100 megawatt plant, and the banks would ask them, so who's buying your energy? And they said, well, we've got 3 people. And they'd ask us, so Eskom is not buying your energy? That's the first thing. I said, no, we're selling it to Anna and to Steve, not to Eskom. And so can we sign a 20-year PPA? They said, no, absolutely not. We can give you 5 years. So of course, the bank sort of went back and thought, my goodness me, that fun days of money for Mahal is over, right? We now got to adapt to a market and a changing electricity market, and I thought that was fundamental. Yeah. And Standard Bank, your competitors and others adapted to that. I think it's fundamental to think through where you really shifted your mindset to think about long-term PPAs, a single off-taker, vertically integrated system, and saying, actual fact, that model no longer exists. We're going to fund this thing in the way to be able to manage our risk and ensure that does happen. I mean, just from a NECOM point of view, the biggest risk to ensure that we got to build 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts every single year. So your 117 days, it's fine, right? I mean, I always say this. I think Eskom's plant performance has done exceptionally well on this winter in itself. What we track is not the energy availability factor. It's an important part. We track unplanned outages, because that's the major factor that influences whether machines cut out or not. And so you've got to track that, right? And if that sort of stays at a level above 13,000 megawatts, then you're in trouble, because your margins between what you produce as generation and what is demanded during winter is quite thin. Let me just give you a good example. We produce on any given day probably between 33 and 35,000 megawatts, right? In winter, our demand probably peaks at about 31, 32,000. In some, it's slightly lower. But in some, it's lower also because we can take more machines off for maintenance, planned maintenance. But that's a sort of margin. So we're always on a thin margin. Our reserve margin, which is sort of universally accepted, is 15%. That's that margin between what is demanded and what is generated, right? So you have that buffer. We don't have that. The only way you can address that is new generation capacity. That's fundamental. So we've got to build 5,000 to 6,000, and Chris's point is right. Any amount of evidence that is there, it is cheaper to build renewables, and as technology evolves, hybrid-related projects where you use different forms of storage is important. So 10 years from now, it will look very different. You could potentially even use renewables with hybrid for smelting, right? We don't know. So potentially that's the case. But the only way we can get out of this crisis is precisely that. So I think that's going to be fundamental. But what is the biggest risk? The biggest risk is grid access. So I like the question you asked Sandile and them. Because the one aspect is to roll out the 14,000, and just to give you a perspective. That means 1,200 kilometers a year. I don't want to ask anybody what Eskom did last year. Sandile can give you an answer during lunchtime. But it's certainly not 1,200 kilometers a year, right? So we've got to find a combination of where we get the ITP and this important project, because it's unique, it involves the private sector, combination of other investments where the National Transmission Company of South Africa is able to build it out. And then there's money, right? Highly concessional. In the JET program, we have about $5.5 billion concessional chief financing to support rollout of transmission. I suppose what the risk is that we can't really do it right now because Treasury has underwritten quite a bit for Eskom under the debt moratorium conditions. I think they're probably saying they will say yes and go ahead once those debt moratorium conditions end, as we know, by the end of this year, which allows a bit more flexibility for the National Transmission Company to look at cheap capital and access to that capital to build out. The third aspect is, of course, the transformer projects. also for you to build, don't go and build in the Northern Cape, man. So can you tell your clients, you know, anywhere in South Africa on any given day is better than the best sun-shining day in Germany. Anywhere. That's the evidence again, right? So, you know, there is about 12 gigawatts of available access of grid capacity elsewhere in South Africa that we can still utilize. But there's also the transformer projects, which I think could unlock another 18 gigawatts over the next 3-4 years. We've got to unlock that quite fast. But that's the biggest risk and uncertainty, I think, for any one of the projects to get uncertainty. But it's also the biggest risk for us from an energy security point of view, because we've got to build new capacity. We've got to. And that is at least a minimum of 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts between now and 2030. Building that, sorry if I may, I know you said I must watch that I don't speak more than 3 minutes, right? I mean, building that is so fundamental for growth. And I say this because, and I'll take this as I won't speak again. I say this again because we sort of think of the growth dilemma as we're going to grow 3.5% by 2030. We just need energy security to meet what we're doing right now. So we're growing at 1%, right? If we slightly grow at 2.5%, we don't have sufficient energy. That's the reality. Anybody can crunch those numbers, right? The point is that, in my view, and this is fundamental, energy security and the ability to address that and to build out, as Christopher says, is fundamentally linked to growth. The only way we get 3.5% if we do actually build out that ability of 5,000 to 6,000. That drives growth. Because what it does, it brings down cost, and we can look at it. I can give you another number. For those who dabble in the energy market and buy energy, you're paying at a wholesale access price from Eskom, 2.06 cents a kilowatt hour. If I compare to the last reprogram, on average, what was wind and solar? Between 65 and 70 cents a kilowatt hour. If you're a banker or if you're an economist, what does it make sense? It makes sense for you to invest, and that's why business makes those choices. So building out new capacity, bringing down cost, makes you suddenly more competitive, and you are able to export your goods if you dabble in the export market, but generally so for society as a plus. So I just think it's important for us to be able to think of this as quite a critical element. It goes back to the first question, that energy security, energy efficiency, energy poverty, and the fact that we can compete and grow much more better is intricately linked to energy. And if we get those investments right, we will grow at 3.5% by 2030.
Absolutely. And speaking of the solve or the equation, Anna, I mean, just want to turn to you quickly. Speaking about integration, the importance of ensuring that we think about not only energy supply, but also transmission and distribution. But actually, if you wouldn't mind extending that to, you know, how do we think about that from a regional perspective? Because I know that's a lot of the work that you're doing focuses around that. So could you give us a sense of how important that is, please?
Before I do that, the methodology, I mean, the formula was just described.
Yep.
The symbiotic relationship between regulatory clarity, change in era, market, change in Schedule 2, adoption by the banks, innovation. So the laziness is directly correlated to the regulatory regime that allows for it.
Sure.
And South Africa allowed for it. Single buyer model, no changes to regulations, blah, blah, blah. So this is the symbiotic relationship of the partnership. The government acts, gives clarity, liberalizes the market, the private sector follows. Yep. Otherwise, if they don't do that, we'll all be lazy. So I think that's one. And now we take it a step further, where we look at regulation clarity, not only within a single country, but we look at how do you, now as a financier, how do you look at going above and beyond single country sovereign risk by pooling country risks across the region when you look at supply and demand dynamics in electricity. And why do we do that? Because we don't want South Africa to be hit with the IMF through their Article 4 calculations like they did in Kenya in 2018, they come in, and Kenya never gave any sovereign guarantees over their utilities power purchase obligations, so they didn't report any national treasury impact. And then the IMF comes in and says, well, we don't care that you didn't give any sovereign guarantees, you take the demand risk. It's take or pay contracts. Suddenly, the Kenyan Ministry of Finance has to report $5.4 billion on their national treasury. That's how integrated it is. So if the IMF doesn't say that the national treasuries and World Bank's credit guarantee facility for the ITP, categorically, they have to say that is going to be off balance sheet. And I question whether they will do, now I'm going to make even more enemies, because it's a regulated revenue model that pays for the ITP, regulated under South African national control only. Therefore, it's South African demand risk for monetization and amortization of that particular line. Therefore, the only way to achieve true national treasury de-risking and off-balance sheet financing model is to link that transmission capacity to regional demand, which is 10 times X than available supply currently, and those interconnectors, no matter if the whole tariff structure in South Africa fails, they will give you risk mitigation, and you can, through merchant models, which is the South African SAWEM and SAP, monetize those lines by the private sector outside of the regulated tariff model. And that's what we are calling for, that we look at it through the whole lens, regulatory clarity in each country across the relevant project, then the financial, how do you track finance, how do you track blended finance, European Commission, EFSD, what is EFSD going to guarantee? Hopefully, it's going to alleviate your Basel III requirements, so you can channel more funding. You see, and then that's the puzzle. That each project that we work on, we look at that every single piece of puzzle. It's quite time-consuming, I must admit, but it's beautiful and it's exciting. And it makes for sustainable policy and financial innovation, consequently delivery of execution of the actual project, and hopefully no fiscal impact. So we give the justness of that transition by giving public sector money where it belongs, where those most deserved require it. So, sorry, I can go on and on and on, but I'm going to stop myself now.
Look, we'd be absolutely delighted to channel more financing into infrastructure generally, certainly to the extent the regulations make that easier for us. So, yep, we look forward to doing that. I've done a hopeless job of managing time, and I see instead of having 15 minutes for Q&A, we've got 5 minutes. So I think perhaps we open it up to Q&A from the floor. I see there's one hand up.
Thanks, Steve. Rudi mentions 5 to 6 gigawatts a year. That's no less than 150 billion rand. I'll comfortably take everybody for lunch if we hit 25 gigawatts over the next 5 years, Rudi, and that money's safe. Sandile, we live in a country where it takes 3 to 4 times longer to do the paperwork than to build the project. 3 to 4 times longer to do the paperwork than to build the project. This is not sustainable. If we're to hit the 5 to 6 gigawatts a year, we need to bring down the paperwork to at least the same time as it takes to build the project. You know, I told you earlier, we've built a main transmission substation, 1.4 billion rands worth of transmission infrastructure in 16 months. Eskom's budget to do that is 60 months. So we've got to fix this. So Sandile, my question is, how do we solve this paperwork problem? We're there, the money's there. Here's my partner, Standard Bank, right next to me, Steve. It's no issue. I don't believe the money's a challenge, 150 billion rand a year. We'll see huge economic growth, Rudi. We'll hit the 3%. But we can't take 6 years for paperwork. What do we do to solve this? Thanks.
Sandile, I believe that's addressed at you.
Yeah. There's a lot of money on this question.
Do you want me to take a look?
If you want to, you can.
I mean, you're spot on because you're addressing it to ISA, but I mean, I think what we did was to try and sort out these issues, right? I mean, that's why I was saying early on, we had to track through where it is. Now, I'm seeing where the projects, a lot of them are stuck. A lot of them are stuck, for example, on ATS CAA, so Air Traffic Navigation also. A lot of the projects actually now have done registration. So look at the registration data, for example, on NERSA, right? We've been able to get that out of the way, for instance. 11.7 gigawatts, 1,900 projects since 2022, right? So if you take it from that, the next is grid access, your budget quote to final, your grid access, right? And paying the deposit, and then for you to then achieve commercial, to close, and then commercial operation date, you can announce it because that's how long. We all stuck it some way or another, but I think we've significantly reduced, and I see some of the projects move quite fast and others get stuck along the way. I think the biggest constraint was EAAs, for example, water use license. And then there was an interesting law that I saw in KZN. This guy pulled out the Building Permit Act from 1977. And I don't think we've ever amended it. But now think about someone that operates building and construction in 1977. Number one, there was no computers. Number two, everything was done manually. Everything was written down with a pencil and a rubber, right? You rubbed it out and you did it over again. And the system was designed like the department will endeavor to respond in 60 days to your thing. So they still do the 60 days right now, right? I mean, 60 days then was important because you physically had to drive the thing over there and put it out. So you could understand that I think we've got to go through that. And I think there's an undertaking in the energy one-stop shop, guys. I mean, because it's sort of under my work that I've done with Sandile and them, is to try and ensure that we introduce efficiency in the system. But I must be honest, if you're going to build, here's a challenge. If you're going to build where you're going to be next to an airport, you're in trouble. If you're going to build within 15 kilometers or 15 kilometers maximum from an SAND base, you're going to be in trouble. And I'm not saying it lightly, I'm saying it because you've got to then go through a different permitting authorization system to be able to get them to give you a non-objection letter. And let me tell you how difficult it is to get that. You know what a non-objection letter is, simply saying, no, we don't object to you, right? And we'll write a letter for you, you just have to sign it, the sort of admiral or whatever, the general, lieutenant general. But it's very difficult with those kind of stuff. So it's a bit of hot and cold. And I do think we've got to deal with it on a case by case. I think we've done pretty well in getting it through as quickly as possible. But I think there are blockages in the system, particularly on some of the authorizations and permitting. And I know, for example, miners in particular, where they're building on mining land, have to now also apply for land use change in the MPRDA, for instance. That's another nightmare, right? And we're trying to change that also, by the way. So there is something, and I don't even say this, right? I wanted to promise you this. But there is a security bill that we're trying to get through Parliament to circumvent all of that. It's what do you call this? Bills that takes everything into account.
Yeah. It's like a kind of framework agreement, but there's a special word for it.
Yeah, sorry, I can't get to the word right now. But it's something that tries and deal with all the miscellaneous stuff. Thank you, Nkululeko. An omnibus bill. Thank you, Nkululeko. An omnibus bill to try and deal with that on energy security. So we're getting through that and hoping we can get through the projects. But I think the biggest risk still is for many of the project developers. Speak to anyone. Grid access. And that we can't fix immediately. That one we can't fix. We can set the rules, right? We can do curtailment, right? And NERSA is trying to set the rules so it's fair and transparent. And that it's not Eskom setting the rules. And that when you give a cost estimate letter, it's not suddenly changed and withdrawn. Or budget quote, and you pay the deposit and it's also withdrawn. Can't happen. We can't have that kind of thing. That's what creates uncertainty in a market that we're trying to build 5 to 6 gigawatts.
Thank you, Rudi, for the comprehensive response. That's unfortunately all we have time for. So I'd just like to thank my panel for a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate your energy and enthusiasm. Also appreciate you traveling to be with us today and for taking time out of your busy days. We literally only covered 50% of what we had planned to cover. So that was the richness of the debate. So I thank you all, and hopefully those that still have questions are able to catch you over lunch, if that's okay. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.